Welcome. We'd like to welcome you to our series of conversations on biopolitics and democracy. In these conversations, our intention is to raise awareness of the political tensions that mark the ways in which states and society are facing the current global health crisis, and understand how the pandemic has transformed our forms of life. We would also like to propose a critical exercise of imagination for possible futures after the pandemic. And we are delighted to have Rodrigo Nunes with us today. Thanks for joining us, Rodrigo from Rio. Rodrigo is professor of modern and contemporary philosophy at the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Is the author of Organization of the Organizationalists, Collective Action After Networks, published in 2014, and numerous articles in journals such as Le Temps Moderne, Radical Philosophy, South Atlantic Quarterly, and others, as well as several media outlets. His latest book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, A Theory of Political Organization, was published in 2021 with Verso, and we will be hearing a bit more about it today. So, welcome, Rodrigo. And the first question that we would like to ask you is, what changes has, in your opinion, as the pandemic brought about to our understanding of biopolitics? Do you see a tension between securitarian mechanisms mobilized by the state to protect the life of populations during the pandemic and democratic life and actions? Or perhaps phrasing it a bit differently, do you think it's possible to take care of life democratically?
Well, thank you very much, Daniele and Federico, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to take part in this project, of which I've managed to follow a little bit, and it's been fascinating to see some of the interviews that you've already done. So I would say that in terms of what the pandemic has changed in our understanding of biopolitics, I would say that there's been basically three main areas that, at least for me, in which, at least for me, the pandemic functioned as a catalyst for a change in the ways I thought about these questions, or allowed me to think more clearly stuff that I hadn't yet thought about these questions. And the first one of which is an area that's often, I think Roberto Esposito in particular has made a lot of a supposed mystery surrounding this question. I think he overstates the mystery a little bit, but still, I think we often find that in authors like Foucault, Achille Mbembe, who came up with the concept of necropolitics, and I would say even Esposito himself, the question of the relationship between biopolitics and necropolitics feels still a bit undercooked or underdeveloped. And I think the pandemic has helped me clarify my understanding of this connection, in the sense that the mystery, the supposed mystery of the convertibility of biopolitics in necropolitics has come to me very clearly now with the pandemic, to hinge on the question of borders, or on the question of the boundary separating lives to be protected and lives, an unprotected life that can be allowed to die, to suffer and die, or even at the limit be killed. And what's curious about this connection between the convertibility of biopolitics and necropolitics is that in the fact that it hinges on boundaries, it hinges on the border between protected and unprotected life, is that this is actually very clearly elaborated in the very earliest thinking about biopolitics, by which I mean in the beginning of the 20th century in authors like Kielen and von Uexküll, where you have, through this vitalist, organicist understanding of the nation state, a very clear connection established between biopolitics and necropolitics, between the life that must be protected and the life that at the limit could be killed for the protection of the life that can be protected. Obviously, this element was taken to its extreme by the National Socialist state in Germany, but I think the very extremity of the Nazi experience blinded people to the actual banality of this fact, to the banality of this conversion between biopolitics and necropolitics, and the fact that actually it's perfectly operative all the time, not just in these extreme cases like the Nazi state, or according to Foucault, the Stalinist state, around the concept of state racism, which I think is a highly problematic concept, because I think the connection it establishes, particularly to the Soviet state, is based on a metaphoricization of the idea of race, which is highly problematic. But that's a different question. Anyway, I think what was very clear in the early formulations of the question of biopolitics, and was taken to its extreme in the Nazi experience, ended up being obscured in the thought of later thinkers who tried to work through these questions by a number of reasons, by the fact that by blindness to the colonial experience, and particularly the fact that the colonial experience, the fact that the borders of European nation states were exported beyond the boundaries of Europe to other areas of the world, and with the expansion of those borders, the expansion of the division, of the separation between protected and unprotected life, so much so that one of the very conditions for the protection of life in Europe was the colonial enterprise. So first of all, the fact that much of the elaboration on biopolitics has taken outside of a proper reflection on the global dimension of the emergence of biopolitics in Europe or in the global north, and how that was dependent on an expansion of necropolitics to the rest of the world, but also a tendency which is very characteristic, I think, of the 80s and 90s to pit, or even because no one was really talking about biopolitics in the 80s, the 90s and early 2000s, a tendency to pit biopolitics in opposition to class or to class analysis in such a way that the internal boundaries of the nation state were obscured, i.e. the boundaries between the lives of workers and the lives of those who profited from the works of workers, which were protected in different ways. And also perhaps specifically in the case of Agamben, another thing that helped to obscure this relationship was the tendency to pit subjects in general against a government in general, without attention to the different levels of stratification within nation states, and the fact that not all lives are equally protected, and not all lives are equally, or not all lives can be as easily rendered superfluous. So not all lives are equally exposed to becoming homo sacer, or to equally exposed to the states of exception. So that would be one thing. The other thing would be the observation of a transformation of biopolitics, the ways in which for centuries, hopefully not, 4 decades of neoliberalism have changed biopolitics itself. And I think this is very clear from, obviously, Brazil and the US and a few other places. India, for example, would be very extreme examples of this. And if you're looking at it from the perspective of Brazil, you can see this very clearly. The convertibility between biopolitics and necropolitics in the pandemic had a lot less to do with racial questions, even though obviously the way it played out was determined by the dynamics and structures of racialization in these different countries. And well, India is a different case, because in India, the racial question is a lot more marked and it is a lot more present. But ultimately what determined the boundary between protected and unprotected life was the free play of the market, was, you know, who had access to, who had the luxury to stay at home rather than being forced to go to work. And in countries like Brazil, this was mostly left to the market, because the very little support that was given for people to stay at home was very temporarily circumscribed and not really enough to allow people to stop working altogether. So, you know, ultimately it was a calculus of, or a calculation of economic utility that determined who was going to die and who was going to live, or who was going to risk their lives more and who was going to risk their lives less. And another area in which this becomes very clearly is the phenomenon of collaborationism on the part of the medical profession with these dynamics, these necropolitical dynamics. In Brazil, this was a huge and very visible phenomenon. And it's completely different from the way in which the collaboration of the medical profession worked, say, in the Nazi state, because the doctors who were participating in these necropolitical dynamics, they weren't self-professedly adhering to a state-organized project. They weren't adhering to a project at all. What they were doing was exploit a market niche that was left open by the fact that the state refused to act, which is, you know, the tendency that we're familiar from several areas, not just public health, throughout the neoliberal experiment that we're still living through. So, you know, doctors, you can describe doctors as having collaborated in what you can describe as the necropolitical policy that was apprehended by, for example, the Brazilian state during the pandemic. But they were doing so as market agents. They were doing so as people who were offering people who were being left on their own by the Brazilian state the possibility to do whatever they could individually to protect themselves. So it's also, it's a phenomenon in which 4 decades of privatization became very obvious. The privatization, economic privatization, of course, with the rollback of public health, but also risk privatization, because the whole idea with alternative treatments like chloroquine was, well, here's what you can do at home on your own, since no one else is going to protect you. And even we could say cognitive privatization, in the way that you know, all sorts of questionable evidence and studies was mobilized to generate distrust in vaccines, and on the other hand, generate trust in these alternative treatments. As for the question of whether there is a tension between the protection of life and securitarian measures, and whether life can be protected democratically, I think it can, and it absolutely should. The reason why I think many people, not so much in Brazil, precisely because people were reacting to a complete refusal on the part of the state to act at all. But in the US, not the US either, but in Europe, where governments at first, particularly in places like Italy and France, enacted very strict lockdown or generally sanitary procedures, I can understand the sort of backlash that those procedures have produced, again, among part of the European left, which has led some people, I would say, dangerously close to a denialist position, or to an anti-vax position. Why do I understand that some people would arrive at these positions? Not anti-vax, that I can't understand, but you know, why would some people express a lot of mistrust of governments? Ultimately, I think it's a sign of powerlessness. It's the sign that precisely we cannot guarantee that whatever measures we agree to now will not you know, continue to exist and creep into ever more areas of life, in the same way that the measures purportedly taken for our protection in the name of the war on terror did. And we have this experience of, you know, lots of measures that are supposedly introduced to protect us just become mechanisms of surveillance, etc., etc. And if you're in a position of powerlessness in the way that the European left is, i.e., if you're in a position where not only you have very little expectation of being in power in order to roll back these measures or redirect them in this or that way, but you're not even in a strong position to fight them in parliament, or you're not even in a strong position to fight them in the streets. And I can totally understand why people would be afraid of supporting those measures now and regretting them later. Having said that, and I would say this was is that the third or the fourth thing? The third, I think that that this pandemic, these 2 years of pandemic, have impressed on us, is that on the one hand, these 4 decades of privatization in the broadest possible sense, like I was saying, economic, subjective, cognitive, etc., one of the effects that it has produced that's become clear in the pandemic is a certain blindness to scale and complexity. Like when people, when the libertarian response to the pandemic was like, well, this is up to each individual to decide what they're going to do, which obviously can, like this kind of solution can apply to some things, but it cannot apply to something that relies on phenomena that relies on complexity or that depends on complexity and certain effects emerging at a certain scale. Obviously, if it were down to each individual period, that would mean that it would take us very, very long to get out of a pandemic like this, because if you don't have a critical mass of people who've taken the vaccine, then the vaccines won't work, and so on and so forth. And people continue to mobilize the fact that, and this is the great advantage that the right, especially the far right, have over us, the fact that they can use the flaws in their own thinking to feed back into their position. Then now people can say, well, but the vaccines clearly didn't work because people are still catching COVID. People are still catching the Omicron variant. Because obviously the thing that they didn't understand was, or they don't understand, or they pretend not to understand, is these complex processes such as these depend on certain on them happening at a certain scale, or depend on critical masses, critical thresholds being crossed. But this also means that a lot of the spontaneous political thinking of the last few decades, which would see that would generally assume decentralization to be a solution for everything. And here I'm talking about a lot of political thinking in the left, not in the right. The idea that everything should be devolved locally and that amounts to autonomy, etc. What I think matters of scale, like a pandemic highlight to us, is, well, in many ways, decentralization can be considered a solution to several problems that we face today. But as a principle on its own, to decentralize, period, is too one-sided an idea. Ultimately, in the context of the pandemic, to decentralize, period, would be the position of the libertarian right. And what has become obvious, to me at least, with this pandemic, is there are processes that necessarily need some kind of management from above as well, which doesn't mean top-down, doesn't have to mean top-down, but it does mean that you need a sort of double structure of local management and management at a higher scale, which obviously should be democratic, and I believe can be made democratic, but obviously is not what we have at the moment.
That's great, Rodrigo. Thanks. I think that connects quite well to our next question, which is about your new book, which I tried to show, but Zoom boycotted it by blurring the cover when I showed. But in your new book, it's called Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, you propose a new theory of political organization, and you critically engage with, a series of traditional oppositions that you sort of started mentioning now. For example, this idea of an opposition between horizontalism and verticalism, or party versus network, or avant-gardism and spontaneism, so on and so forth. And you use these oppositions to think in a different way, and you propose sort of an alternative, which for me in the book appears, especially with the concept of organizational ecology, which I think is a very interesting concept. Could you perhaps tell us a bit more about the book and maybe this concept in particular? And how does this new theory of political organization can help us understanding and analyzing social movements that emerged and are active during the pandemic?
Well, the book is a bit of a funny beast in a sort of way, because it's obviously a book about social movements, but it's a theory book on social movements. It's a theory book on social movements that's not social movement theory. So it functions at a certain level of abstraction, which, maybe people organizing during the pandemic, people organizing right now, wouldn't necessarily find any immediate how-to ideas in the book, but that wasn't what I was trying to do. What I was trying to do was to change the way people thought about organization, and I thought that demanded moving back to a higher level of abstraction, because part of the problem that we have when people are trying to think about matters of organization is they're working from several received ideas and maxims and cliches and traumas that don't actually amount to a coherent theory. And I thought, well, there's a space here to try and build a theory from scratch, within which people can find what they're doing and can find ways of framing what they're doing that will be more productive than, say, these oppositions between centralization and decentralization, between horizontalism and verticalism, etc. Obviously, one of the things that the theory has to do then is precisely, instead of choosing one of those alternatives in any of those conceptual pairs, what the theory should do is to provide us with a way of thinking from which we can see those two different directions as emerging from a common problem, or from a set of common problems that anyone doing any kind of political organization would do, and then would face. And then the question is not building your politics or your ideas of organization around an identity of yourself as a vertical or yourself as a horizontal, but understanding that these two things exist in a continuum with one another. And usually the kind of question you're faced with in practice is not, should I be horizontal, should I be vertical, but how much more centralization do we need here? How much more decentralization do we need here at this moment? And in order to do this concrete thing, and so on and so forth. So it's trying to build, the question is then trying to build a theory from which people can face practical problems, rather than either prescribing an ideal organizational form that everyone should have or belong to, or rather than leaving problems of organization to like a set of predetermined ideas that would come with an identity, like being a vertical or being a horizontal. So it's also about unmaking those identities by showing their common ground. And the concept of ecology is of organizational ecology is very important for that, because on the one hand, I think it does away precisely with what has always been the tendency in the way people dealt with the problem of organization, which was, the natural tendency was always, you assume that what the question of organization was trying to answer was, which organizational form should we have? And what I'm saying is, well, actually, people who are organized in whatever way are always organized within a larger milieu of different organizations, of people who aren't part of any organization, people who are unaffiliated but can be mobilized by certain causes or by certain organizations. A milieu in which there are several different kinds of organization, and then the question is not what is the right kind, since you have a plurality of them anyway, but the question is, how do we relate these different kinds to one another? How we, how do we connect these different parts? So this is kind of where the idea of organizational ecology is going generally. But then the other thing that it does is, if you think of an ecology from the point of view of network theory, what you have is precisely a kind of network that is neither centralized, i.e. revolving around a single hub, or decentralized in the way that you have areas that are completely unconnected to one another. Everyone has the same weight and the same power to influence other parts of the network, so on and so forth. What you have is a third kind of network, which is called, the technical name for which is distributed, which is precisely a combination of nodes of different sizes, built around or organized around local clusters, but also having connections, distant connections with one another to different clusters, and so on and so forth. So you have something that looks a lot more like, say, a constellation, as we see it in the sky at night, if you're lucky to be in a place where you can see it at night. Rather, again, than being a choice, should we have one organization centralizing the whole ecology, or should we be okay with just everyone doing their own thing and we don't try to coordinate anything at all? The question is, well, there should be enough autonomy and there should be enough coordination. How much is enough autonomy? How much is enough coordination? Well, that depends on who you are, what you're trying to do, what moment of what you're trying to do you're in, what the actors that you're facing up against are doing, etc. But what I was just saying, that the pandemic has made it clear to us that decentralization alone wouldn't, if you took that as the single principle around which to organize your political action, decentralization alone couldn't deal with the problem at the scale of the pandemic. So it's obvious that you also need levels of or degrees of centralization, which is completely different from saying that you need you know, one Leviathan to oversee everything. So I guess that would be one of the lessons that with which the book could contribute to any politics happening now, while we're still in the pandemic, or in the near future, whenever that is, when we've come out of the pandemic. There's a lot of other things that have become evident regarding political organization in the meantime, I guess. For example, you can look at the effectiveness with which the right wing have organized. They have organized their base. They have managed to organize popular movements against, I mean, popular, you know, I'm using that word without making any assumptions about the class profile of the people who participate in it. In a country like Brazil, the class profile would actually be middle and upper class, so not popular in that sense. But they've built movements around the opposition to vaccines and around the opposition to state intervention on sanitary matters, which is, you know, in the middle of the pandemic is the perfect example of that moment. And in Anti-Oedipus, when Deleuze and Guattari say, you know, how is it that people can bring themselves to protest for less bread, more taxes? Nowadays, it's less bread, less taxes, but still. But a few other things that I think have been highlighted by the pandemic. I mean, one is the overall tendency that we've observed in relation to, say, you know, early vaccination campaigns in the first part of the 20th century is the shrinking of the circle of protected life. In most countries, the boundary of protected life has shrunken quite dramatically, and there's increasingly more and more people who are unprotected, or whose protection depends exclusively on a calculation of economic utility, the cost against the benefit of protecting those people, which connects to one of the things that I talk about in the book, which is, you know, how I would say always, but if this shrinking of protected life is the case, then increasingly over the coming years, one of the best sites from where to start political organization is choke points in social reproduction. And, you know, we've seen that clearly with the refusal on the part of the state to act to protect the lives of large numbers of people, but also, you know, what the pandemic has made clear about the state of public health, or the state of public service more generally. So, you know, if it is the case that the circle of protected life is shrinking, then that provides us with a privileged space in which to try and intervene politically and to try and organize in order to build a social base, but to build a social base precisely in a way that's different to what the far right has managed to do during the pandemic, because what they can build is, or what they want to build is movements that can be switched on and off by the political agents, the political actors that bring them, or that help bring them into existence, and boost their message, etc. Obviously, this is not only what we should want to do, to just find a social base that we can manipulate according to our political calculations. Obviously, this shouldn't be what an emancipatory politics is about. But also what we had in the last decade, particularly at the start of the last decade, with the experience of the global cycle of protests that began in 2011, was precisely this experience of moments of explosion that failed to build a permanent social base. You would scale very quickly from a few hundred people out on the streets to several thousand, but then this would go down again, and yeah, that was gone. And in fact, once that was gone, once that energy was gone and some of that base was gone, that's exactly where the far right came in. It was precisely that energy that was left without a vessel, or a lot, not only evidently, but a large part of that energy that was left without a vessel, that the far right would exploit in the second half of the last decade. So, so what this shows is the far right has been a lot more effective at organizing during the pandemic, but not only their model of organization shouldn't be the one that we should go for. If we went for that model, we would end up at the same place, probably, where we can have these big outbursts of social mobilization that leave very little in the long term. And one of the things that I'm trying to draw people's attention to in the book is precisely the importance of that other kind of organizing, that longer term kind of organizing that that builds social bases in the long run. The last thing I would say that I think the pandemic has brought to the fore is the importance of global logistical chains, but also their fragility, and the importance that both political organization around these logistical chains, including evidently, or perhaps primarily, the organization of the workers who make these logistical chains, who keep these logistical chains running, but also the question of relocalization of these logistical chains, which then connect to the greatest problem of social reproduction of them all, which is global warming, which is climate change, which is the Anthropocene. So not only will these logistical chains, or should these logistical chains become privileged sites of political organization, but also a key question in politics for the coming years should be about, how do we shorten these logistical chains? How do we relocalize the economy? How do we bring the global economy that we have back to something that is, so to speak, within our ecological budget, something that is sustainable for the whole of human and non-human life in this planet for centuries to come. And yeah, so that I have the feeling there was something else to say about this, but
no, but maybe I can provoke you. I can provoke with the next.
Oh, sorry, I just remembered. So the question is at once, and this again ties back to that issue of the avoiding treating centralization and decentralization as these two extreme poles out of which you had to choose only one, but thinking of them as existing within a distributed continuum. The question is, on the one hand, how do we relocalize logistical chains, or how do we relocalize the global system that we have today, while at the same time not avoiding the creation of any social reproduction choke points for the majority of the world's population. So we need to radically transform the system that we have today. At the same time, we need to radically transform it in such a way that people won't just be left behind and die in the process of that transition, because we haven't built the, say, the contingency plans or the alternatives that can fill the gap of these left by these long logistical chains once they roll back. And now back to you.
No, thanks. What I was thinking was just, I think you started this exercise already when you talk about, thinking of forms of organizing in the long run and sort of more long-term structures that are capable of grouping this energy that you mentioned before, but also, when you talk about forms of political organizing that consider, for example, climate change and the urgency of that. So I think that, part of this project is also to propose an exercise of imagination. And I think that, maybe you started doing that, but perhaps I would say, I would ask in the few minutes we have left, how do you imagine the future of political organization after the pandemic?
Yeah, I guess I've already started saying that in some way. I mean, it will have to be attentive to and capable of acting in questions of scale. So we need the kind of political organization that allows us to act and to employ leverage at different levels between the extremely local and the wholly global. Because on the one hand, obviously, at the wholly global sense, there is no leverage. There is no point on which you could even find support for a leverage. So it's impossible to act on that level. And therefore, in a certain sense, action is always local. What people forget with the word local is that local is a relative term. Something is local in relation to something else which is being considered global. So local doesn't presume any particular scale. Obviously, in order to build social bases in the long run, and therefore also the political capacity for acting at higher scales. You need to have strong interventions at a local level in the most, say the smallest scale. You know, you need to have strong community groups or strong neighborhood groups, etc. You need to have, you know, say all the local population down the route of the pipeline, all the people in different localities who are going to be affected by that. You need to have strong organization in those places in order to have the political capacity to act on something like, say, the building of a pipeline. But on the other hand, you need to build that capacity, that local capacity, into a force that is capable to act at higher levels with sufficient force that it will eventually produce global effects, that it could eventually produce, say, a transformation of the global economy, the shortening of our supply chains, but also the end of the fossil fuel industry, which should be one of our most immediate political targets, because it's really a matter of life and death at this point. So yeah, there is a section in the first chapter of the book that that plays on that old slogan from Attack France, which was think global, act local. And I respond to that with think and act global and local, which is obviously a lot more work than to just think global and act local. But it is what we'll have to do if we're going to have any chance at preventing not only the direst effects of climate change, but also pushing back against the expansion of the extractivist frontier, or of the extractive frontier, pushing back against the expansion of the frontier of commodification of all sorts of different areas of life, and finally push back, as a consequence of the first two, push back against the shrinking of the circle of protected life, not only in the poorest countries of the world, but even at the very heart of the capitalist system. So that would be it.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, for this wonderful conversation. And thanks everyone for watching. Please feel free to check out the other videos on our website, and see you next time.